So for this series of lessons, we're going to continue our deeper dive into the physiology of tissue repair. We've had some overview of some of this information, but I want to get to a little bit more specifics in these lessons. The first lesson that we're going to focus on here is the physiology of physical stress. Just a couple of theories I want to hit you with. So you have a decent understanding now of what's going on. So the first theory I want to talk about is really just looking now at physical stress in relation to trauma. So we really have two different types here, macro trauma and micro trauma. When we're looking at macro trauma, we're talking about a singular force that is of sufficient quantity to create an acute injury. So if you fall, get hit, something like that with a one single instance. So when you think of this, think of acute injuries. With microtrauma being relatively low intensity forces that on their own are not able to produce injury, but the cumulative effect of those injuries are enough to cause trauma. This is where we will start to look at from the standpoint that the stress is greater than the repair. So naturally, after a physical stress, there's going to be micro trauma to the body. If there isn't enough repair that's taking place, then you'll get a breakdown and you can get to that micro trauma. So when we look at this, we first need to understand physical stress theory. And this is relatively simple. This idea here is that in normal circumstances with normal amounts of force, we get maintenance of the status quo. Right? You've seen this and heard about this in strength training courses, where in order to get gains, you must go beyond what has currently been done. Right? And so that moderate or positive overload stress, right, leads to an increased tolerance, right? In this case, we're talking about hypertrophy. If the stress is too great, we can get injury, and then in extreme stresses, we can actually get cell death with that. But the opposite applies as well. When physical stress is decreased in the human body, our body will adapt to that as well by decreasing our tolerance through atrophy, and in low to none cases get death. So the idea here then with physical stress theory is that there is an optimal amount of tissue loading right here in the middle. Right? That includes maintenance. If we want to get gains, we could go up above that, right? And if we need to protect the tissue, right, we can go below. General adaptation theory then goes with that and talks about how the body responds to stress. So it has the three stages of the stress response: alarm, resistance, and exhaustion. The idea here is in the alarm stage, the body initially reacts to the change with that, and then it's going to resist by trying to adapt to the stressor, right? By simply trying to repair the stress that is occurring or maintain homeostasis. After a while, the body starts to lose and the stresses cannot be withstand any longer, and that's when we get to the exhaustion stage. So here we see this depicted graphically, where first we have an increased training effort, right? Increased forces applied to the human body that produces stress, and then that microscopic tissue damage. Right? And so this is now the acute phase of that we saw. Then we can get into the resistance phase, right? Where going down here, the idea is as long as the rate of remodeling is greater than the rate of continued tissue damage, we get stronger tissue. Once we get that stronger tissue, then we need another increased training effort. So we have to continue down this way to come back up to get an increased training effort in order to continue to see gains within that. And so the premise of this within rehabilitation is the idea that if we want to continue to get stronger tissue, we have to continuously get increased training efforts. And that's where we add weight, we add reps, we add different components to continue to increase that training effort. However, if the rate of tissue remodeling is less than the rate of continued tissue damages, this is where we get to exhaustion phase, which gets into overuse injury. And finally, a decreased training effort is eventually needed to allow for tissue remodeling to occur. So when we get now here to physical stress with regards to treatment, the idea now very much is that the intensity of the modality, right, needs to be just right. Anything that's too low or too short has no benefit. So this could be a cold pack that's only applied for 5 minutes. It could also be a strengthening exercise that doesn't have sufficient force. It's too easy. On the same note, though, we can get to the point that if it's too great, we will now get too much tissue damage, not enough healing. So this could either be a modality like ultrasound that's too high, or a modality is like doing too many exercises. And I'm using the term modality to describe more intervention than true modalities. So when we look now and we combine the acute phase of healing with the acute phase of tissue response, you can see here we've got the trauma, which causes the primary injury. We talked about the different components then associated with that, how we have to go through that first stage even before inflammation, where this now here is preventing blood loss. We then get into the inflammatory stage, which we talked about last time, where we get all of those chemical mediators and such going on with that to then get into a situation where we can enter into the repair phases and hopefully then get to a point where we have optimal recovery, full return to participation, and a decreased risk of injury. If we don't allow the repair phase that we will talk about next to fully be utilized, then we get a less than optimum recovery. If that is participated with a return to injury, then we get a greater risk of injury. The last thing I want to talk about in this introduction before we get into the proliferation phase of healing is connective tissue. And connective tissue is what we're going to see as the main healing type tissue throughout. It is the same as other connective tissue in the body. It's the most abundant. We'll see it's important that it's produced by fibroblasts, and there are two components with that, the ground substance and the collagen fibers itself. And so the collagen fibers and elasticity then are what's going to determine how stretchy it is and how much it can absorb some of the force. So there are two types of collagen fiber types in there: inelastic collagen fibers and elastin fibers. So when we look at this now from a connective tissue, there are also different types of connective tissue that you'll look at as well. There's elastin and elastic tissue, but we're primarily going to be looking at dense regular connective tissue and dense irregular connective tissue. And really, when you get into this, you can see here in this picture, right, the organization of this in somewhat of a straight line. And this is dense regular. Same thing here. You can see how all of this collagen is in a similar type line there, right? Whereas if you look at this dense irregular, you can see how squirrely it is opposed to being in a singular direction. There are also then different types of collagen fibers that we need to look at. The ones we are most going to be concerned with is type 1 and type 3, right? When we look at now type 1, this is what we're normally going to be going with, and we'll see here type 3 will be a transition type. But you can see these are other different forms of collagen fibers as well. Lastly, here I want to look at the different types of connective tissue cells what they go through. We're primarily going to be interested in fibroblasts and myofibroblasts there, whereas the fibroblasts are going to be the ones that create the extracellular components, right? And the fibroblasts do that as well, but these have a contractile property that we will see is important in wound contraction.